If we think about this as a series of concentric circles, right? There are some things that are just absolutely clearly in that core center circle, things that we can just count on as bedrock, right? That there's a God in heaven, that Jesus Christ is our Savior, right? That Joseph Smith was a prophet of God, the Book of Mormon is the Word of God, right? I mean, there's this handful of things that is clearly for the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints in the middle of that circle. Is the doctrine of the family, meaning that marriage is only between a man and a woman, is that in the center circle or the next concentric circle out?
All right, welcome to the Cwic Show. My name is Greg Mattson, and I am your host. My guest today is Patrick Mason, Latter-day Saints scholar and Mormon Studies scholar. I'm going to give you just a quick bio on him. He's kind of a big deal in Mormon Studies. He is an associate professor of religious studies and history at Utah State University, where he holds the Leonard J. Arrington Chair in Mormon History and Culture. He is the author and editor of several books, including most recently Restoration, God's Call to the 21st Century World, which I've read, and with David Pulsifer, Proclaim Peace, the Restoration's Answer to an Age of Conflict. And we're going to be covering that book in this episode. There's several subjects, Patrick, that I want to cover on this. I want to go first to the Washington Post article that was written a couple of weeks ago. You were quoted in that, as you oftentimes are in national publications. And I want to go over just the two quotes that you have and talk about those a little bit. This is an article that was written by Emily Kaplan. It focused primarily on the LGBTQ issues within Mormondom, if you will. And she starts to allude to an idea of, well, where are things going to go in the church? And here's what your quote was in response to this. I can see multiple futures for Mormonism. I honestly don't know which way it's going to go. The one thing I know is that I think the church leadership is going to try and hold the whole thing together. That's always been the impulse, to prevent schism. That is going to be increasingly difficult, but they're going to try. When you say you don't know which way things are going to go, what do you mean by that? And how does the church hold this together?
Yeah, so what I mean by that, and thanks for the question and the opportunity to talk about it, is that I don't think it's going to be a surprise to anybody to say we're seeing a lot of division, not only in our broader culture, but within the church as well right now. Divisions on the left, divisions on the right. We're seeing this broadly, but we're seeing within wards, within families, especially on social media. So that's what I'm alluding to when I'm talking about the kind of pressures that are on the church. And I can see especially around kind of what we might want to call kind of culture wars issues, things like that. These are issues that have split a lot of other churches, especially Protestant churches. So the Methodists, the Global Methodist Church, it's about to probably break up around some of these issues, especially around women's ordination and LGBTQ issues. The Global Anglican Communion has seen schisms around this. A lot of other churches have. So there are all kinds of pressures on all religious churches, including our own, around these kinds of issues. So I mean, as a historian, and when I'm talking to Emily Kaplan or any other journalist, I'm talking, in my perspective as a historian and as a scholar of religion. And I can't predict the future. I don't know what's going to happen. But we can look at some of the things that have happened in some of these other churches. So is it possible that our church moves to the left on some of these issues, right? Accepts some of these positions? Yeah, absolutely. That's a possibility. It's a theoretical possibility. Is it possible that the church moves to the right on some of these issues and does something like what the Southern Baptist Convention did in the 1980s, where it moved right and became more conservative on issues of morality and family and gender and sexuality, and actually crowded out a lot of the liberals and moderates who had been a part of that denomination for a very long time. Yes, it's possible that the church does that. Or is it possible? And I think the most likely scenario, like I said, I think the church tries to hold it all together. I think the church leadership doesn't want to be a left church. It doesn't want to be a right church. It wants to be the Church of Jesus Christ. And it wants to hold people together who have a variety of different kind of ideological or political or cultural views, but are able to do so within the framework, the kind of doctrinal framework that the church provides. I think that's the most likely option and outcome. But as I said, as a historian, I see other paths that other churches have taken, and those paths are always available.
So you brought up this, Christianity more broadly. I've got a lot of close connections, kind of in the higher ups of the Anglican Church, Church of England especially, but also with the SBC, and where they may have moved to the right in the 80s, they're moving very strongly, especially in the last year or two, over to the left. And looks to me like there's going to be some major problems. I don't know if the SBC is going to hold together. I'm almost positive it's not.
Yeah.
And is this, when you say hold it together and you're talking about moving to the left and moving to the right, the psychology behind this, is this just because people are geared toward a worldview culturally or intrinsically that's going to be on the left or the right? Because if you're going to crowd people out, is it because of a cultural movement, or is it just the way that people are, and we have to figure out how do we hold people that naturally lean to the left in and people that naturally lean to the right in? How do we do, because that depends on that is going to determine, to me, the messaging that's going to determine the efforts that the brethren would make on this.
Yeah, well, I mean, for me, the church is not a political body, or at least it shouldn't be. And this is one of the reasons that we see, especially among evangelicals right now, that a lot of younger evangelicals are leaving their churches, is because they feel like their churches are too political, or have become too political over the past generation or two, specifically in that case, too conservative. I mean, the churches aren't supposed to be that. The church is supposed to be a prophetic witness to the world of a different kind of way of being in the world that doesn't fall along ideological lines in terms of the way that we organize ourselves in the kind of secular, political, and cultural world. And so I think the church, whether it be our church or any other church, but let's just talk about our church. I think the church is only faithful to its calling and what God asks it to do in the world if it isn't held captive by ideology. So of course, people within the church, and we heard this from President Oaks in the past General Conference, that there's room for people within the church to affiliate with lots of different political parties, right? Lots of different political ideologies. I think the church leadership is trying to restrain us from extremism on either side, left or right. But within the kind of broad center, so to speak, there's a huge range of opinions on all kinds of issues that the church itself has no opinion on, whether it be tax rates or education policy or any number of things. So we reasonable people of goodwill can disagree about these things, but we find hopefully common ground within the church. And what I think we're losing a little bit, and there's a lot of sociological studies that show this, is that it used to be that religion was a good predictor of political ideology and political behavior. Now it's turning the other way around, and people are bringing their politics into their religion rather than taking the norms and values that they learn in religion and taking that out into the public square. So I'd like to see, I hope, I mean, really, my hope and wish is that we keep a church that it includes a broad range of people with a lot of good ideas and want to do good in the world in different kinds of ways, but we come together out of a common set of norms and values and shared doctrines, and that's what makes us a church.
So let's talk about policy a little bit, and how pressures might be going towards Salt Lake on this. Sure. There's an interesting dynamic happening in the church right now, and that is that you have really the the voice of the United States, right, left and right, where obviously the church is headquartered, that is, as a culture, to me, the culture war was won by the left a while ago. But you have a pressure more from the left, I would say, in the U.S. toward Salt Lake to make changes, and yet, and maybe I'm sure there's an ear to that, right? Yet the areas that the church is growing the most are actually more conservative, than the United States. So if you go to the Philippines, if you go to Africa, and even in many cases, especially with identitarianism and identity politics, you actually, even in South and Central America and Mexico, their leaning left is very different. It's very old school. And so you've got these areas of great growth where the church, actually the population of the church is actually growing to the right in those cases. But the voice in the US and in the West is growing stronger on the left. How do you reconcile that?
Yeah, well, you just put your finger on it exactly. And I'm sure I'm not privy to any of these conversations in Salt Lake, but I'm sure that's exactly what they're seeing too, is that especially with generational change in the United States and Europe, where the church has been dwindling, actually not just stable but dwindling for a while now. There is this move to the left, especially among people, say, ages 40 and under. But you're exactly right. In the growth areas of the church, they hew much more conservative to kind of traditional views of gender and sexuality and family. So how do you hold all this together? I mean, I'm glad I'm not a general authority with that job. I think what we're seeing from them is you hold it together through a shared commitment to a core set of common doctrines, centering on Jesus Christ and his gospel, centering on the kind of restored scripture that we have, not only the Bible, but Book of Mormon, Doctrine and Covenants, Pearl of Great Price, shared commitment to the idea of sustaining living prophets and apostles, although that gets complicated because we don't think they're infallible. And so what does it mean to disagree with them sometimes? And what is the range or the limits of that kind of disagreement? But I think, especially, for instance, this most recent General Conference, it was a set of, a pretty tight package of core doctrines that they seem to be broadcasting out to that entire world, whether it be, the kind of progressive left in the US or more traditional societies around the world. I think their hope, and I think there's a lot to this. If I were going to put my money on something, this is what I'd put my money on, is that can you hold together around a core set of doctrines and commitments focused on Jesus Christ and his gospel?
Okay, to that point on the doctrines, here's the second quote I wanted to go to from the Washington Post magazine article. You state, in terms of the LGBTQ issue, you say people have already started to do the work to sketch out a theological rationale that would allow for the kind of revelation that allows for women's ordination, for same-sex marriage, all kinds of things. And then you say what was once possible then becomes probable. Who are you talking about that's sketching out the theological rationale? And aren't these core doctrines also that would go along with the doctrine of Christ? Yeah.
So it's, when you do interviews with journalists and when they write their stories, you don't always get to choose how they will use your quotes. And so when I was talking with the author there, my memory is that I was speaking purely descriptively there. I mean, the fact is that people are doing this kind of theological work. And that kind of theological work does create new possibilities. But she ended on that quote, possibilities become probabilities, as if I was in some kind of predictive mode or there was some kind of teleological, inevitable march towards that kind of thing. And that's not what I meant at all, because actually history is full of possibilities or roads that are not taken, right? Just because somebody comes up with a great idea doesn't mean that anybody agrees with it or follows it. But it is true that people are doing theological work along these lines. So people have been thinking about women and women's ordination for decades now, both, of course, broadly within Christianity, but within our church as well. So it's not new to the ordained women movement of the past decade. This goes back to the 1970s in terms of people actually recovering some of the theology and statements that go all the way back to Joseph Smith and women and priesthood and the establishment of the Relief Society, and then sketching out what those possibilities might look like moving forward. And then just in the past, really it's been decade and a half, people have started to do theological work around LGBTQ issues. There was an important article, for instance, in Dialogue about 10 years ago by Taylor Petrie called Toward a Post-Heterosexual Mormon Theology. I think that's probably the most cogent and articulate effort along these lines. Now, you don't have to agree with anything that these people are doing, but just descriptively, it is true. People are out there doing the work. There's a new book by Blair Ostler called Queer Mormon Theology that's doing this kind of work as well. So people are out there doing it.
But you're talking about academics mostly.
Mostly academics.
Yeah, not
exactly.
actually general authorities.
No, this is not coming from general authorities. General authorities aren't theologians in our church. They serve a different role. And actually, historically, I mean, the prophet and the theologian are two very different things. Prophets declare, and then theologians reflect upon those declarations and what's received by the body of Christ as doctrine. And so the prophet and the theologian are two different things, and general authorities, by and large, aren't theologians. Occasionally, they write books that are kind of theologically, or give general conference talks that are sort of theologically oriented. But it's a very different thing to be a prophet or apostle than to be a lay member who's a theologian, whether you're an academic or not. I would say we're all theologians in a way, but people are actually writing and publishing this stuff. They're not general authorities.
It's been a long time since a prophet has written a theological book while he was prophet. A very long time.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Yeah.
Okay, so let's draw that over a little bit more, because I want to focus a little bit more on this issue of doctrine. And you recently had a podcast with Faith Matters, and you're a part of Faith Matters, is that right?
I'm on the advisory board or something like that.
Okay.
And they published my most recent book, or my penultimate recent book, Restoration.
Yeah. Okay. So here's this speech at BYU from Elder Holland, which is what the episode you had, the topic that you had on this episode there on that podcast, really kind of brought a lot of things to the forefront. And I think the reason it did is, to me, Patrick, it seems like the what you talk about, a theological work moving toward some type of new type of doctrine that would change the doctrine of the family, is really what caused the feedback to me on his speech. Right? It's not, to me, it's not so much the Muskets, it's not so much the valedictorians. If I think that if Elder Holland would have come out and said exactly what you just said, that there's work going on to see if there's a way to make these changes, none of the musket fire or the valedictorian stuff would have ever been a controversial issue, right? But he comes in and says a few things where it's almost like he's reaffirming, right, things that have been stated in the past about the doctrine of the family. Let me go over a couple of his quotes real quick. He says, referring back to Elder Oaks, he says, then Elder Oaks said challengingly, I'd like to hear a little more musket fire from the Temple of Learning. And again, he's talking to faculty, by the way.
Right.
That's who he's talking to, and that's what he means with this. He said this, he says, in a way that could have applied to a host of topics in various departments. Again, talking to the faculty. But the one he specifically mentioned was the doctrine of the family and defending marriage as the union of a man and a woman. Bingo. That, to me, right there is the center of everything. And as I watched that episode of yours, and I've seen many other episodes and read many, Twitter threads and blog posts, and it just seems to me like everybody tries to skirt around this issue. And it wasn't until the very end of the podcast you were on, that you were a guest on, that one of the hosts actually really directly brings this up. And there's a lot of other talk, and it just seems very obvious to me that there is a decent percentage of church membership that wants the change, right? They want the change on the doctrine. I just think it's important that we talk about that,
sure,
instead of skirting the issue, right? I don't like the musket fire stuff. I think it's misinterpreted. The valedictorian thing, a little bit different, maybe, but I think, look, the issue is the doctrine of the family.
That's right.
And he's reaffirming that by calling it. He doesn't even bring up the proclamation on the family. He calls it the doctrine of the family. And so there has to be, if a progressive hope for a change to same-sex marriage being included in the church is approved in any way, there has to be a change to doctrine. Does doctrine change? Or is this really not doctrine that he's calling doctrine?
So yes, doctrine does change.
Okay.
Sometimes it's changed many times on many issues in the history of our church, even in the young history of our church. So I know that that's a concept that's uncomfortable to a lot of people, but just the fact of the matter is doctrine does change over time, and we should be comfortable with that in a church with living prophets and apostles. And so we have a 9th article of faith that says God still has many things to teach us, great and important things, pertaining to the kingdom of God. So we believe in a church of ongoing restoration and ongoing revelation. Now, what are the limits of that, right? Could we reveal ourselves out of our testimony of Jesus Christ? No, right? And so I think this is actually, this is the debate right now, and the discussion is the doctrine, if we think about this as a series of concentric circles, right? There are some things that are just absolutely clearly in that core center circle, things that we can just count on as bedrock, right? That there's a God in heaven, that Jesus Christ is our Savior, right? That Joseph Smith was a prophet of God, the Book of Mormon is the Word of God, right? There's this handful of things that is clearly for the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints in the middle of that circle. Is the doctrine of the family, meaning that marriage is only between a man and a woman, is that in the center circle or the next concentric circle out? That's the discussion and question that a lot of people have. We know that it has not always been the doctrine of the church that marriage is a union of a man and a woman. So the doctrine of the church has changed around marriage, not around the sexuality in marriage, but about the numbers within marriage. That doctrine has changed, and it's not just policy, it is doctrine. We could go to lots and lots of teachings from the prophets and apostles from the 1860s, 70s, and 80s. So that doctrine of the family and doctrine of marriage has changed. Now, have we landed on the final, the final iteration of this? Maybe. I mean, I'm fully prepared to say that we may have landed just like we've landed on Jesus Christ as our Savior. It may be that we've landed absolutely on the doctrine of the family as it's meant to be revealed in its fullness. Or does God still have more to tell us? That's the question.
But okay, so I'm going to ask you this then. Is it doctrine that changed, or was it practice? Because is there really a change in the doctrine of either of section 132, for example? So is there a change in the doctrine that happened, or was it a change in the practice?
Well, is the family proclamation doctrine, and where do we put that next to section 132? So section 132, which actually still is in force, and we have 2 members of the First Presidency who are sealed to multiple women. So that's still the practice of the church, not in a temporal marriage sense, but in an eternal marriage sense. But the family proclamation and the law of chastity, as it's currently expressed in the church, is that marriage is between a man and a woman. That is the stated doctrine right now. so we're in tension with ourselves right now in terms of the way we define marriage, the way we define celestial marriage, the way that we do it and talk about it, and what we have in our scriptures and in our practice. So right now we already have a tension on that particular part of the doctrine. And I would say it is doctrine. I think both of those are doctrinal teachings that are in tension with one another.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So let me dig a little bit deeper on this and just talk about the consequences of something like that, and what that would mean. Because, for example, does that change our association with the Adam and Eve story? Right? Does that change our obviously our practice, but our teachings and doctrines that happen in the temple, for example, right? You're talking about not just a practical change of marriage. You're talking about a very core practice and what I believe is doctrine, right? That you get in the temple and that you have in the Adam and Eve story.
Absolutely.
Okay. So it would require a massive change of temple practice, not
That's
just
exactly right.
the sealing at an altar.
Yep.
Right. It would be a massive change of the temple.
That's exactly right. So that's why, and that's why I don't know if it's possible, certainly not inevitable, because it would to accept same-sex marriages on the same basis as we do opposite-sex marriages, including all the way up to the sealing ordinance, would require a mass, as you say, this isn't just, two different people at the altar, right? It would require a massive reimagining and retelling of our story, and the story that we have in the scriptures. Now, a lot of gay theologians, queer theologians have been doing this more broadly within Christianity for decades now. I think that it's different within the Restoration tradition. The stakes are different because we actually think that marriage persists into the eternities, right? So this is actually it's a far more difficult issue, and it's if that rock is going to move, and I don't know if it is, it's a far bigger and heavier rock to move than is true in other Christian traditions that don't have our theology of eternal families. So that's why, I do not predict anything. I don't think anything here is inevitable. I think some of the work that theologians are doing is interesting, and they're addressing these issues in really interesting ways to sketch out ways to think about this. But right now, it's not going anywhere.
Yeah, it seems to me, I mean, as I look at, for example, the creation story and the Adam and Eve story that we have and what it's used for, to me, that's temple liturgy. Sure. It's not just something that was written in, I think the most confusing and insightful verse in all of Scripture is Genesis 1:1, right? In the beginning, because that throws everything off. You think you're looking at the beginning of history. It's all, starting with in the beginning, and I'm ending up and going all the way to Abraham and beyond and the children of Israel. And it looks like it's this unfolding of history. It's not. Right. That is a vision. The creation story and the Adam and Eve story are given to us through visions. Yeah. That Moses had. We know this from the Book of Moses. That Abraham had as he looked through the Urim and Thummim. Right. And so this is what they bring, and it's liturgy is revealed to him. It is made for the temple, and that's why it's there in the temple. It's not there just to tell some kind of history. Right. Right. It's made for the temple. So it just seems to me that, that needs to be thought about and discussed more, because absolutely that is a big change. That is absolutely.
And there's the theology of it, which is a huge thing to think about. Mostly what Tom and I were talking about on that podcast was not any kind of change to our theology or doctrine. It was thinking about, what do we do right now in this moment? Right? Given the doctrine that we have, given where the church is at right now, given the fact that we have so many of our LGBTQ sisters and brothers who are hurting, and family members and friends and others. We have people leaving the church every day, every week over these kinds of issues. Given that, and Elder Holland talked about this, right? I mean, one of the most moving parts of his talk was where, he just broke down in tears saying, we're talking with people, we're praying with people, we're meeting about this, we're talking about all this time, which suggests to me that at least some of the senior leadership of the church, that they know that we haven't figured all this out. Even if we have the theology is right, we still haven't figured out how to minister to people, and in their pain, in their experience, in their grief. And so that's most of what Tom and I were talking to. At least that's what we went on the show to talk about. The big theological questions, that's sort of a conversation, a bigger conversation. But as much as anything, we're just interested in focusing on what is people's experience right now, today, given the context that we find ourselves in.
Well, look, as far as the hurting goes, honestly, I can't think of a harder thing. I'm sure there are plenty of harder things, but I don't know that there is a greater burden for someone, at least collectively in the church, than having same-sex attraction or being gay, whatever you want to call it, or an issue of transgenderism or anything else and trying to square that with the church and trying to square that with the gospel. I get that. It's, and so you kind of look at these values like, well, who doesn't want to relieve that pain? Right. Who doesn't want to relieve that pain? I think there are very few people that would, at least those that understand, would dismiss that. Right. And yet, is there another value that is taking precedence, that is doctrinal, that says this is at least your temporal burden that you have to, that you're carrying, right? And then the issue to me becomes, well, if that's the case, then we really do need to learn to minister to that. And we better figure that out and do a much better job than we've done in the past of trying to help those individuals. But I still see, again, the core, it doesn't stop from same-sex marriage in the temple. That's where it's going to go, I think. It always does. I actually, when I looked at that went through that podcast, I went through it a couple of times, that episode, Tom Christofferson, who seems like a wonderful man, he actually brought it up a few times, and it was kind of that hope that it would change, that there would be a change to the practice of marriage and eternal marriage. Yeah. And in his response, when the one host at the end kind of brought up, in fact, I want to bring this up and what he had said here. He had said, this is what the host said. He said, there's a stance that says we have more doctrine than just Jesus is the Christ, and doctrine doesn't change. He's saying that that's the stance. So what is doctrine? Maybe a standard definition is what the First Presidency and the Quorum of the 12 have taught consistently over time. Bringing the argument from the more conservative side is to hold up the proclamation on the family and say, look, we have doctrine. And Tom's response to that, I think, was clear. His was, the doctrine on the family is fuzzy. I think he used the term hazy. And the focus should be on Christ, is what he said. We're the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. I don't know. To me, that's not quite enough. I don't know that it's, the doctrine of Christ is very individualistic, right? If you go to 2 Nephi 31 and 32 and kind of go through the little checklist there, it's very individualized. It doesn't go beyond that. Into relationships, I think, in interpersonal relationships. But he wants that. It seems to me, I'm trying to ask you, isn't there a certain percentage of people in the church, mostly progressives, that's where they're going to go. That's where they're going to push, is going to be, it's not ministering, is what I'm saying, right? It is the actual doctrine.
Yeah. Yeah.
So what, if that isn't going to change, what happens? What do we do?
That's the $1 million question. I mean, and I don't want to speak for Tom, but I think when you hear him speak, not only in this podcast, but in the books he's written and all the firesides that he does, basically there are at least two things that he knows. He knows that the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints is true, and he's committed himself to that, consecrated himself to that in a way, and made sacrifices for that in his personal life in ways that I don't understand. Mm-hmm. And he knows that he's a gay son of God. And he's a member of a church that now teaches in a way that we didn't teach a few decades ago, but now teaches that, people are born that way, can be born that way. And he knows those two things. And at least, and so he's trying to make sense of it in that podcast, in his books, everywhere else. And he knows that there's a tension there, and he's living in that tension. And so when I that's where we're at right now. That is the tension. For people who, and so this is not about responding to people outside the church and various kinds of cultural pressures. This is about people inside the church who know and feel those two things, that they are a gay or lesbian or transgender son or daughter of God, and that they believe the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints is true. And they're trying to make those two things work. And there's not a clear path for what that looks like, either on either side of the veil. Right now. That's where we're at. So when I hear Elder Holland say, we're praying about this, we're talking about this, we're discussing this, we're weeping with people, it's because I think I read Elder Holland's comments to say they know there's a tension there too. And we want to find a better way, even if whether or not the doctrine ever changes. Is there a place for the Tom Christoffersons of the world inside this church? I sure hope so, because he's one of the best men I've ever met.
Do you feel that Elder Holland was doubling down on that doctrine and practice?
Well, yeah, I mean, clearly, I mean, you're exactly right. I mean, he wasn't talking just in general terms about defend the church. He mentioned the doctrine of the family, of marriage between a man and a woman. So that is the doctrine of the church, period. So that's what he was talking about.
All right. I want to move to your book, Proclaim Peace. So this is it here. I got this last week, pre-ordered it. I usually go Kindle, but it's not available on Kindle until November. So this is Proclaim Peace, the Restoration's Answer to an Age of Conflict. And I think that what we've been discussing so far kind of rolls right into some of the precepts and ideas that you have in here. You open up the book with an example of Enoch and talking about Zion. So I'm trying to figure this out. You've got a man here that is in a outside of, well, actually the whole world probably at that time, or pretty much close to the whole world, is described, I don't know if I've got that quote here. Yeah. They are without affection and they hate their own blood. And so I think we could insert with affection, love in there, right? They're without love and they hate their own blood. And so here's an individual. This is what I love about the stories of the prophets, because it brings out individualism so much to me. It's a singularity that says, I've got society here, I've got the church or society as a whole, and one individual is where it starts. And you have someone then says, to me, must accept the calling he has, which we all have to some degree, and the mantle of saying, I take on the responsibility of everybody. Right? It's not just I take on the responsibility of myself, which most of us just have a really hard time handling.
Right.
Right? I'm taking on the responsibility of everyone. And it matters to me, and I feel their pain, and I am going to accept, as we do at baptism, bearing their burdens, regardless of how wicked they are. Right? Now, he goes from that to creating a Zion people, a Zion nation, if you will, that is carved out from the rest of the world. And apparently Melchizedek does the same thing. Mm-hmm. And now, one difference with Enoch than what we might experience today, he has 350 years to get this done.
Right.
Apparently.
Yeah.
He's got 350 years to get this done. And, you just think about it, and you think about the incredible cost to him and the kind of life he must lead for those 350 years.
Yeah.
Of joy and suffering simultaneously, right? Exactly. That he goes through. Is that an example to us also of what we should be doing in terms of first maybe holding our families and then maybe the church, and then beyond that together?
Yeah, we're supposed to be Zion builders. That's exactly what we're supposed to do. I mean, in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, we have some core and fundamental missions. One is to proclaim the name and gospel of Jesus Christ to all the world, and another is to build Zion in preparation of the second coming of Jesus. It's not just, and this goes back to a point you made earlier, it's not just about individual salvation. Never has been for the Latter-day Saints. It's about being saved together or not at all. For Joseph Smith, it was very clear that salvation was a communal affair. So it's the individual, the family. Joseph Smith actually didn't think all that much about nuclear families. That actually is a development that comes later, largely with Wilford Woodruff and in the 20th century. But it was always this sense of individual, family, Zion, all of the children of God, right? And so the Zion building project is exactly what we should be about. That's why I love the story of Enoch. And I think Joseph Smith's theology, it's predicated so much on this story. I mean, this is an early revelation to him, right? He gets the Book of Mormon, and then shortly after that, he starts on the Bible translation. This Enoch vision, this Enoch revelation just leaps off the page. In fact, when they take on code names later on to try to kind of hide from their enemies, Joseph Smith, he clearly resonates with Enoch and even some of his other writings and the way he sees himself. So yeah, Enoch's project should be our project. Absolutely. That's what we're called to do. It's always been the project of the people of God. As you said, Melchizedek, but also the disciples of Jesus after in the old world and in the new world after Jesus' death and resurrection. In both of those cases, they create Zion societies. The people of Alma do it very briefly. I mean, we have this handful of occasions throughout Scripture that truly committed and converted disciples. It's not just good enough to save themselves and their families. They're trying to build Zion. They're trying to build godly societies.
Well, it's interesting to me as you go back and look at the history of the church, that as you go, at least starting in Kirtland, right, and then moving down to Jackson County, far west, Nauvoo, every time, even though the Lord obviously knows that things aren't going to work out,
right?
It's where's the plot for the temple? It's a place of gathering. It is called a land of inheritance every time. And it's just over and over again. That's the process. That's what you're going to do. That's the anchor for building design people is going through that same process.
Yep. Gather. That's always the impulse from President Nelson. Gather, right? That is the impulse.
So I want to go over a couple things here. There was, you talk, I'm going to go through a few of these chapters that you had in here. One you talk about is power and influence. I really liked some of this. You say here, I'm going to quote here on opening your chapter on Well, let me move beyond this. You say your chapter actually on the theology of conflict is what I wanted to go to. You say you open up the chapter with the following, I quote, "A theology of peace that endorses the enduring and transformative power of love cannot pretend that conflict and violence are not real." Do we sometimes mistake what love means in the church and in the gospel? And do we sometimes ignore and even put our heads in the sand when confronted with the reality of conflict in the gospel and in our lives?
I think absolutely. We, as Latter-day Saints, we're good at a lot of things. One of the things we're really good at is conflict avoidance. And I think we take it from a bit of a misreading, I think, of what Jesus taught the people when he came to the Americas in 3 Nephi 11. Remember, right out of the gates, after he's shown himself to them and he speaks to the disciples briefly, he talks about, he says, contention is not of me, contention is of the devil, right? And we've interpreted that as conflict is of the devil. But that's not what Jesus says. Actually, he says that the difference between conflict and contention is that contention is born out of anger. And that's what he says. It's that you should not be angry with one another. It's Satan who puts anger in your hearts. Conflict is just built into the very nature of creation. Starting in Genesis 1, which you mentioned earlier, right? You get night and day, you get day and land, land and water. You get male and female. I mean, at every point, God is introducing division, tension, conflict. That's what, I mean, Lehi says there has to be opposition in all things. Otherwise, nothing means anything. So conflict is actually what gives us meaning. And conflict itself is neutral. The question for us is, how are we going to engage that conflict? Are we going to engage it in anger, which is when it becomes contention, and that's what Jesus specifically warns us against, or are we going to engage it in love? And love is not passive. Love is not weak. Love is active. Love is forceful. We would suggest in the book, because the scriptures say it, love's the most powerful force in the universe, literally. That's not Hallmark card stuff. Literally, God is love. The being that we worship, his primary characteristic is love. It is the very nature of power. And so sometimes love has to be forceful. You know, when your child is running out into the street, you don't say, "I love you, Johnny, please stop." You grab Johnny, right? So that Johnny doesn't get hit by a car. I mean, love will force us to be active and assertive and proactive at times. But that's the difference, is do we engage conflict in love or do we engage it in anger?
So you say that sometimes we're not real good in the church on we embrace conflict avoidance.
Yeah.
Are you saying in here that I mean, I believe this. Aren't conflict and love completely tied together then, based on that?
Yeah, they have to be, right? I mean, think about any relationship you have that is worth anything to you. Conflict is going to be a part of it. So if you are married, think about that. If you have a great friendship or siblings or something like that, or parents, right? We all have parents. Those are the relationships that matter most to you. The relationships that teach you the most about love and how to love. Those relationships, conflict is embedded in each of them. And actually we only grow through working through conflict constructively. And of course we all mess up, right? We all do it destructively at times, and then hopefully we learn lessons, and that's why we have the gift of repentance. But any relationship worth a hill of beans is going to have conflict baked into it. And so we become better people. We become beings of love as we learn how to navigate that conflict.
How to deal with that. Yeah, I like that. I like that. So should we be asking for conflict in our prayers?
Well, I mean, it's like anything. You be careful what you ask for. I mean, I think life gives us enough. The fact that we are all eternal intelligences, right? That we are all eternal free agents, and have been from the foundations of the world, right? there's going to be plenty of conflict just baked in, right? I don't think we need to seek it out. There are times where we have to speak truth, right? Where Martin Luther King talked about these. He says, I'm not afraid of conflict. And he says, I'm not afraid of generating conflict where there's a kind of status quo that's predicated on abuse or violence or inequality or something like that. Sometimes you have to kind of stir things up a little bit. You have to introduce some conflict in order to shake up a situation that is unjust. So occasionally we do have to do that, but for the most part, life just gives us enough. We don't have to ask for it.
So I like the example of creation on this. It seems that if you go through that creation story, you end up, as you say, you're dividing, right? And so you're saying that that's creating conflict. It's also creating order, though, right? I mean,
That's right.
As you go through that, you are creating. If you start out the very beginning, you've got the Spirit of the Lord or the light coming in through the chaos and over the deep, and that's where it starts. And then you end up dividing and creating an order out of
That's
this
right.
that seems to be automatically pregnant with conflict as you create order, and it also tells us, I think, that conflict is something that the Lord works with all the time, even in his state.
Yep.
Isn't that right?
Absolutely. I mean, and to think about it, in that division, in that creation of order, it's the places where those divided elements come together. Though it's actually precisely the place of conflict that are the creative and constructive, and oftentimes the most beautiful places. It's the boundary between day and night that gives us sunrises and sunsets, right? It's the boundary between land and water that gives us beautiful beaches, right? And those kinds of things. That's actually where creation happens. That's where this constructive stuff happens. If all you have is a planet full of water, there's not a whole lot of I mean, it's the tension, the division. So there's an orderliness to it, but in that order, conflict comes in as well. And you're exactly right. That's the way that God has always worked. It's the way he works in and through us. I mean, I happen to believe that the family and the church are the two great laboratories of Christian discipleship, precisely because of the conflicts that we experience there and the opportunities we have for growth. And this is not an idea original to me. Eugene England wrote a great essay about this called Why the Church is as True as the Gospel. But it's in the family and the church, in these unchosen relationships, that's the beauty of the ward system, right? I'm placed in a congregation with people I wouldn't choose to go to church with oftentimes. People have different ideas than me, who raise their families, have different ideas about, child raising, or have different political ideas, all kinds of things. And God smushes us all together and says, figure it out. And it's precisely in that conflict, same thing in a family. Other than your spouse, you don't get to choose your family. It's precisely in that space with all of that conflict. That's where we learn to be Christians.
Yeah. It's interesting to me, the Israelites, they would, talking about division and separation, it's, when they would make a covenant, they didn't call it make a covenant. They would say they would cut a covenant.
Yeah.
And so it was cut up at each, right? Where you were separating something.
Yeah,
but the whole idea was, we're going to separate this. But of course, covenant comes from covenare, which means to come together.
Right.
And so there's two sides to it, right? It's like, okay, we're going to make the division. There's conflict. The point is, do we overcome the conflict, or how do we work with the conflict?
Yeah.
And then come together again, like Adam and Eve, right? I mean, story there is, the rib is separated from Adam, just like everything else is end up separated in the creation story. But then there's eternal marriage, right? And it's brought back together at that point.
And then when they have children, right? So now a new generation. So dividing parents from children, and what these siblings who come along, how are you going to engage that relationship, right? And Cain fails the test.
Yeah. So conflict is a creative force.
Can be.
What? How would it not be?
Well, if you engage it in anger, right? If you engage conflict in a spirit of anger, of vengeance, of pride, then it becomes a downward spiral. So where you get recrimination, where you get victimhood, where you get what can be, and this is what the Book of Mormon is so brilliant at revealing to us. This is a conflict that starts with just brothers, right? I mean, this is just a sibling rivalry to begin with. And it escalates over the centuries until you get a civilizational holocaust. You get hundreds of thousands and then millions of people killed because they can't engage their conflict in love. They engage it in a spirit of anger, in a spirit of contention, in a spirit ultimately of hatred. So conflict can be a beautiful and creative force. It can also be the most destructive force in the world.
Can you expound on that example? Because I know you put that in the book. You give the example of the Lamanites and the Nephites in conflict theory. Can you expound on that a little bit more on how that conflict plays out in the Book of Mormon, and where there are those that go against or manage the conflict a little bit better?
Yeah, I mean, we're all familiar, of course, with Nephi and his brothers and that story, and and the tragedy of that story. And we see it, of course, we see it through Nephi's eyes. It'd be interesting to get the narrative through Lemon and Lemuel's eyes. I mean, part of the thing about conflict is everybody has a narrative, everybody has a story to tell, and it usually justifies ourselves. But let's take Nephi as a reliable narrator, as a prophet, as he looks back on his life. I mean, he narrates all these moments of conflict, but there are also moments of reconciliation, right? There are moments where the brothers come back together, where they forgive one another, where they seem to be, that there's a possibility that their family is going to hold together. But then, once again, a new conflict emerges. It's about pride. It's about jealousy. It's about leadership. It's about who's going to be first in the family. All these kinds of things. Ultimately, it's about who does God favor. So it's like Cain and Abel a little bit. And so once Lehi and Sariah die, the family splits apart. And I think, Nephi's beautiful psalm, 2 Nephi 4, some of the most beautiful passages we have in the Book of Mormon, where he just pours out his heart and he feels, his soul is just racked. But he says, why am I angry because of my enemy? Right? Well, who are his enemies? His only enemies at that point are his brothers. And nephews and nieces and others. I mean, that he realizes that this family conflict he's seen the way it's turned into nations. What began as sibling rivalry now becomes two nations who in his lifetime, within the first generation, are already at war with one another. First thing the Nephites do is they build a temple and they make swords, practically in the same breath. And so this sets the pattern for the rest of the Book of Mormon. But we do get these incredible moments. This is where the Book of Mormon is so brilliant. These incredible moments that show people who step out of the conflict, who stop it, who say, I'm going to stop the cycle of violence and I'm going to do it with love. We see it with the sons of Mosiah, who, you remember when they want to go on a mission, all the fellow Nephites say, you're crazy. Those Lamanites are terrible. They're horrible, right? They have these narratives that they want to tell about the Lamanites, right? They're bloodthirsty. They're lazy. They hate God. They hate you. Nothing's going to come of this. And the sons of Mosiah refuse to believe that because they've been filled with the Spirit of God. And so they go in a spirit of love with diverse experiences along the way, but ultimately they lead to the conversion of an entire people, who then the anti-Nephi Lehis are, maybe other than Jesus himself in the Book of Mormon, they are the preeminent example of assertive love, of what it means to stop a conflict, to engage a conflict with love, to transform that conflict. But unfortunately, the Nephites and Lamanites choose a different path, especially at the end of 4th Nephi, and that sets them on the path towards annihilation.
Now, the difference between the two, as I see it, in the Lamanites and the Nephites, the commonality is exactly what you said, right? There is animosity, toward one another on both sides. One side, to me, seems to say, okay, well, we're going to focus on the doctrine of Christ.
Yeah.
And I think the other side loses that. I mean, if I in my study, as I go through it, I see every faction that breaks off, from the Amlicites to the Amalekites to the Amulekites to the Zoramites, they all break off from the doctrine of Christ.
Yeah,
and you can see that with Noah and King Noah and his priests as well. So you have a side that can say, because this applies also to us as church members and looking outside of the church, perhaps, is you have a side that probably is more in the right, and that may not be the aggressor, right? And yet that's not enough, right? That still is not enough. Again, if you really do believe in the doctrine of Christ, then you believe in bearing others' burdens, and you believe in this, as you call it, assertive love, that is to reach outside of yourself and fill this gap that seems insurmountable this time.
And you see the moments, the darkest moments in Nephite history are the moments where they move away from the doctrine of Christ. Right, this long, centuries-long period that's chronicled, especially in Omni, or barely chronicled at all, where he says we're not receiving any prophecies or revelations, and there's a kind of mini apostasy there, and it requires a new restoration with Mosiah and Benjamin. Then we see that in the time right before Christ comes. With the downfall of Nephite society, the wickedness of the Nephite society, where the Lamanites are now more righteous. Why? Because they've embraced Christ, right? And they've transformed their lives because of their embrace of Christ. And then what changes in Fourth Nephi? Well, they decide to build a society built on the doctrine of Christ, right? Built on the love of God that they have for one another. There are no more ites. There's economic restructuring. There's economic justice. They have this Zion society for nearly 2 centuries, and then it leads to divisions. And what leads ultimately to the Nephites' demise is they've rejected Christ once again. And despite Mormon's prophetic teachings, he loses hope because they've lost Christ. So there's no, there's a different set of promises for the Lamanites in the Book of Mormon. The Nephites, they've turned their back on the revelations and prophecies of Christ that they'd had.
Yeah. So you call it assertive love. I think I talk about this a lot especially in the Come Follow Me stuff I do, but, to a modern Western mind, love is a feeling.
Yep.
How do I feel about this person? Or it can be anything from, romance, right, to how I feel about the person. But if you read the scriptures, the context typically for love is action. And so you put assertive in here. In the scriptures, they don't even use assertive. It's just love, but it's a verb. Typically, it's looked at more like a verb than it is a noun. And a verb that, if you really look at the suffering of Christ and of the prophets and of others that exhibit love, that manifest love, it's a cost. Right? Love is a cost. Love is a sacrifice. Love is an effort. And maybe the feeling comes from that, right, afterward. But the actual manifestation of love is that, right? It's a cost. And we can look at that in the word, even the way we use it anyway, to atone for something, right?
Right.
And to pay the price and the sacrifice that Jesus Christ made. One of the toughest things to give, to sacrifice, to pay the cost of, is what you say here in this chapter called The Power of Assertive Love. You say, among the most difficult, if not the most difficult, of Jesus's teachings is his injunction to love your enemies. No command goes against the grain of the natural man or modern social training more sharply, making it both counterintuitive and countercultural. We're in a very ever increasingly polarized world right now, and social media isn't helping with this. And so how do you see this playing out today as far as, loving your enemies? And also, I ask you at the end here, what do you mean by applying countercultural in that statement?
Well, I think we live in a culture of violence, right? Turn on your TV, pick up a video game, right? Read the newspaper. We live in a world that glorifies violence. This isn't new to us. Enoch's world, as you pointed out, glorified violence. They hated their own blood. That was the sin, actually, that God was most upset about and that he wept over, was the way that people hate one another. They hate their own kin. We're all spiritual kin. And so to preach a message of love, and not thin love, not Hallmark card love, right? But Christian love, agape love, love your enemies love. It has always been countercultural. That's what got Jesus killed. A culture of violence ends with God on the cross. And this is what Jesus revealed, was a different kind of kingdom, a different kind of way, a higher, holier, a more perfect way. And it's hard, and it might get you killed. It got Jesus killed. But it's a refusal to see the other person as fundamentally other. It is a recognition of the common, not only humanity, but the common divinity in every single woman, man, and child on this planet, even the person you hate the most. And so that is not the message I get when I turn on the TV. It's not the message I get from politics, from anybody in the political sphere. I mean, this is not the message I get almost anywhere other than the church, the gospel of Jesus Christ. And I shouldn't be so limiting. Of course, I mean, lots of other people, non-Christians, have taught this in different ways, in very powerful ways, right? So this kind of love is not, we don't have a monopoly on it as Christians, but it is the foundation of Christian teaching in a way that isn't necessarily the case in some other traditions.
So, well, I completely agree that is what Jesus taught. I don't know if that's what got Jesus killed, though. I don't know. I have a little bit of a different idea maybe on why he was killed. You're saying he was killed because he taught anti-violence.
No, he allowed himself to be killed to atone for the sins of the world. But that includes the sin of violence. I think what happens on the cross, one of the sort of thought experiments we go through in the book in chapter 2 is that, look, in Gethsemane, we believe as Latter-day Saints, as part of our distinctive doctrine, that Jesus suffered for the sins of all humanity in Gethsemane, right? That he atoned for the sins of the world and bled from every pore in Gethsemane. So if that was the case, as we believe, then what's going on the cross? Some people have suggested, well, he did it all over again. I don't quite get that logic. If his suffering was infinite in the garden, I'm not sure why you need infinity times 2. It seems to me he clearly oriented himself to the cross. He knew his life was going to end on the cross. He prophesied that because of his conflict with the political and religious leadership of the time. He knew that's where his life was going. And I think he did it deliberately and intentionally because it was on the cross that he was able to reveal the absolute sinfulness of our society, right? Not just our individual sins, but that we've structured our society in such a way, we've built a political system in such a way that we would crucify a God, that we would crucify a sinless, innocent, blameless victim because of the way that we've structured our society. So I think the cross, and Paul talks about this in Colossians, there are other places, that the cross, on the cross, Jesus reveals the ugliness, the sin, not just of our human hearts, but of our society.
Yeah. And then, of course, he's, tied to our sacrament, right? He goes to the depths of spiritual sin in Gethsemane.
Yeah.
Spiritual death.
That's right.
To the point that, if we talk about death as a separation, to the point that he's separated from the Father for a time.
Right.
Right. So there's a complete separation there spiritually as he bears everybody's burdens. And then, of course, death on the cross is the temporal death, and resurrection is to bring those together and whatnot. It's, in my mind, it seems to me that this is kind of a tangent here, but it's the same reason to me that Abinadi is killed. And that is that he claims to be the Son of God. and the divinity there of who he is not especially what the Sadducees wanted. And
yeah, I mean, there could have been lots of other ways for Jesus to die. I mean, if he was a blasphemer, they could have stoned him to death. And so the fact that he's crucified, actually, the crucifixion was a political act. The Jews couldn't crucify people, as we know. Only the Romans could. So the Jews, they stoned people to death. The Romans crucified people. So the cross, we can't let go of the sight that the cross has a political aspect. The cross is full of meanings, like any powerful symbol. It can mean a lot of different things. I think Jesus was doing a lot of things in his crucifixion, but he could have died lots of other ways. He chose to die on the cross. So I think it behooves us to reflect on what that death on the cross really means for us.
Here's another comment that or quote that you have in that chapter. As soon as love in the form of forbearance, forgiveness, reconciliation, persuasion, negotiation, mediation, diplomacy, and nonviolent resistance doesn't produce immediately desirable outcomes, we tend to toss it aside for something stronger. I think that this is so true. What is the something stronger?
Violence, or we think it's stronger, right? We think, and this is where, I mean, we're rational beings, but we're awfully irrational sometimes. We've been fighting each other in wars for thousands of years, right? And war has never created peace. It can create truces at times, right? We end wars, but then ultimately it just leads to the next one, because that's the logic of violence. And we tend to think, oh, well, okay, the violence didn't work that time, so we just need to refine it, right? If we have an Army War College, right, and we study the art of war, and we'll be better at war, so we'll do it better next time. And so the amount of resources we put into the perfecting the art of violence is staggering. But then if one, and this happened all the time in the civil rights movement, right? I mean, they march or they protest or they boycott for a few months, and it doesn't bring about change. And people say, see, it doesn't work, right? And so we have so little patience for nonviolent techniques. We have so little patience for persuasion and for negotiation and for these things. And then we immediately say, okay, we got to ratchet it up. That didn't work. Instead of investing with the same kind of patience, we're very patient with violence, right? I mean, look, in the United States, we just ended a 20-year war in Afghanistan, right? And in Vietnam, it kept dragging out and dragging out and dragging out, because we just have this seemingly endless patience for more blood, whereas our patience wears very thin very quickly for nonviolent techniques. And I think that's what we have to re-examine.
Yeah, I think there's something stronger. It can be violence, or it could be coercion, or
absolutely
or force, and other things like that. That's where I get a little bit more invested in kind of the difference between the civil rights movement of the 60s and the radical movement of the 60s. One seems to be a little more coercive, and one seems to be a little bit more, well, we need patience and forbearance and et cetera.
Yeah, and that's a great point. Yeah, most of us don't end up turning to violence in our relationships or things like that, but we do turn to coercion. We turn to manipulation. We turn to the opposite of all those things in D&C 121. Shame, exactly. And so you're exactly right. That's probably a better personal application for most of us, because most of us wouldn't use violence.
Now, last question on this book. You have a section here, a chapter called The Positive Peace of Zion. And I wanted to read this quote because I just pulled this up before we got together here. And you can see here, I've been through this whole book quite a bit and
Thank you.
Studied it quite a bit. But here's the quote from page 198. It says, both individually and communally, these disciples renounce all forms of direct, this is about a Zion people. These disciples renounce all forms of direct structural and cultural violence, and in their stead proclaim peace, thus the title of your book here, fostering the conditions for sustainable peace, justice, development, and human flourishing. Thus, Zion collectively declares the advent and joy of the non-violent kingdom. So is Zion just a place, a state of being without violence?
Yeah, great question. That's what negative peace is. So this is kind of peace studies terminology that we introduce in the book. So negative peace is the absence of conflict and the absence of violence, and that can be a good thing, right? When you're in the midst of a war, simply bringing that war to an end is a good thing. But that gives us negative peace, and and we know that oftentimes, even where there's not conditions of active violence that you can see, there are at the time conditions of active injustice. Think about apartheid in South Africa. Think about Jim Crow in the United States. There was an outright war between whites and blacks, but there was deep injustice and systemic and structural violence that are being committed against those communities. So when peace scholars think about positive peace, the religious counterparts to this are shalom in the Hebrew Bible, or Zion in the Restoration tradition, that it's not enough just to not be fighting with one another. What it means is actually to embrace one another, to build societies based on love. We see this in every Zion society, that they address not just the direct violence in their midst, but they also address all the other kinds of inequalities that exist among them. So that in 4th Nephi, which is my favorite example. I mean, there are no classes, there are no races, there are no distinctions of any kind. And of course, they're still individuals. They have their individual talents that they contribute to society. I wish Mormon would have given us more than 15 verses on how that Zion works and what it looks like. But these are still individual people with all of their gifts and talents and predilections and so forth. But they have found a way to create a society in which all of those other distinctions don't matter. So they've created the positive peace, or a peace that allows for full human flourishing with none of the limitations that come from sexism, racism, classism, all those kinds of things. And so they allow for every single person to flourish. And that's God's vision for his people.
Yeah, because it seems to me like you could have a negative peace, as you're describing it, with tyranny.
Absolutely.
Right. You could take a tyrant, and especially you could limit violence immensely by simply a few very public acts of violence, but just a handful. And limit violence there. But again, the violence might be limited, but it's full of coercion. It's full of manipulation. It's full of strong.
Absolutely. Tyrants thrive on negative peace, right? They want to keep a lid on it. My wife and I lived for a couple of years in Egypt during Hosni Mubarak's reign, right before the Arab Spring. And that was a very peaceful society, all right? But there was no democracy. There was very limited freedom, serious inequality. That was not a free and just society, even if there was very little outright conflict. You know, this is what dictators do. They want to keep the lid on any of this kind of stuff. So that's why we talked about earlier. Sometimes in an environment or in a context of deep injustice, sometimes you actually need conflict in order to expose and then to overturn that injustice. This is exactly what the Civil Rights Movement did.
Yeah, and I know sometimes like U.S. diplomacy often goes toward that negative peace, right? Because, and then maybe it is better, I don't know, but I mean, if you look at the Shah versus the Ayatollah,
right?
What is your choice there, right? You know, it's pretty tough, but
so often, negative peace, again, it can be an improvement on, you know, mass bloodshed, but it's very limited. And you're exactly right. Oftentimes our national and international structures were limited in vision, and we just focus on that. I think we're doing better. Actually, the international community over the past generation or so is thinking more about peace building and things like that. So it's thinking more about development, thinking more about economic justice, thinking about eliminating all the kinds of things that make for unequal societies. So we're learning, but we still generally have pretty limited vision.
Okay. All right, Patrick, I've just got two more questions for you coming out of the book here. Let me ask you about academia a little bit. I have a love-hate relationship with academia. I'm not an academic, but I have entrenched myself in academia as far as research and study for 30 years, and so I just love, I don't know, it's like candy to me sometimes, right? It's just I love researching and getting information from certain topics, history, especially ancient history and gospel topics, etc. But is there an echo chamber? Well, okay, there is an echo chamber in academia, right? It's if you look at the recent polls, you have, especially like with the liberal colleges, over 40% of the liberal arts colleges have zero representation on the right. And if you look at other colleges, especially state colleges and going on from there, the numbers are as high as 90% on tenure track professors that are on the left. And isn't this a problem? The reason I started getting into the whole idea where I actually work with identity politics and social justice and things like that was actually from Jonathan Haidt, who a sociologist, and he's the one who wrote the coddling of the American mind and
was it The Righteous Mind? Is that his
2012? But he's put together something called the Heterodox Academy.
Yeah,
where there's a focus on trying to get a diversity, not just of skin color and ethnicity and sexuality, but actually of thought. If you have, I see in academia, the problem I see with academia, and I see this manifest all the time, there are no checks and balances, it seems, on academia because there's no diversity of thought. How do you work through that?
I actually agree with you. I think it's a problem right now in the American Academy. I think I'm a big believer in kind of old school liberalism in terms of, and what I mean by that is it's a kind of freedom of thought and expression. And this goes back to what we were talking about with conflict. You can't generate anything new if all you have is just a whole lot of the same. That's
an interesting point.
This is why we talk about diversity. This is why we've prioritized it within the academy, is with the understanding that historically we privileged a certain kind of people, mostly upper class white men, right? And so that actually narrows the kind of good thinking that can be done, because you're just writing off whole segments of society where there's so much talent and ideas. And insofar as we're doing that in a different way today in the academy, that's a problem too. I think when I'm a believer in diversity, because I think in the academy, again, we're strengthened by having people from all different backgrounds, but that has to include perspectival diversity. Now, the academy, I think, has certain kinds of rules. I mean, there's peer review processes and credentialing and so forth. So it's not just grabbing anybody off the street, right? I mean, you got to learn how to do what we do in terms of research ethics and things like that. But insofar as we have, and it works a little bit differently in different places in the academy. Business schools have their own orthodoxies and oftentimes have their own ideological orientations. Colleges of humanities oftentimes go a different way. I know less about how it works in the hard sciences and engineering and so forth. But insofar as we create orthodoxies that squelch perspectival diversity, we're doing ourselves a disfavor. How do you fix it? I honestly don't know. And I came out of a graduate program at the University of Notre Dame, the history department there. One of the reasons I went there is there was this great group of religious historians. One, the most famous one at the time, his name was George Marsden. He's an evangelical historian, and he had just written a book called The Outrageous Idea of Christian Scholarship. And George, from his perspective as a evangelical, kind of in the Reformed tradition, he said, look, with postmodernism now in the academy, we've opened ourselves up to feminist viewpoints and Black viewpoints. And at the time, we weren't using the term kind of queer theory, but we could fit that in there. He says, so we've opened ourselves up to all these viewpoints. Okay, great, terrific, right? That captures the range of human experience. But he says what we've done in the secular academy is completely rule out any Christian perspectives or overtly religious perspectives. So he was calling, actually using the logic of postmodernism. George was saying there's got to be at the place at the table for Christians or people of faith in order to bring their commitments and their life experiences just the same way the Black scholars or feminist scholars or other or queer scholars do. I'm not sure. The book was sort of popular and got a lot of audience in the kind of 1990s, but I'm not sure that it's had much impact since then.
Yeah, it might not do so well today.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, and my concern with the postmodern movement is which is everywhere in academia now, is that then it can go to its own extreme, sure. Of really the cores of Foucault, for example, in Derrida, which is relative truth. It's lived experience is the highest truth, and there's no objective truth, and we seem to be moving on. It's still a little on the fringe, but still starting to move a little bit more in that.
Well, and I think there's there are differences between a kind of prudential or pragmatic postmodernism, which I think goes along with a kind of pluralism of just recognizing the huge diversity of human experience and recognizing that with certain disciplinary tools. So for instance, in history, with the tools that I have available to me as a historian, I cannot get at certain ultimate truths. I cannot get at the question, was Jesus Christ resurrected? I cannot get at the question, what did Joseph Smith actually see in that grove? With my disciplinary tools, I can get right up to that moment, or I can say Joseph Smith reported that, or a lot of people witnessed that Jesus rose from the grave. But I cannot, using the historical method, I can't get at some of that ultimate truth. And so I think that then, with that kind of humility, recognizing that, and the same would be true of sociologists and engineers and people in all the other disciplines, there are limits to what we can get in our secular disciplines. And so I think that should, for me, that leads to a kind of prudential or pragmatic postmodernism that says, I can't be overly confident in my conclusions as a historian because I cannot get to ultimate truth. I can't get to the thing itself. All I can get is the kind of reports of it, people's experiences with it. That's all my discipline allows me to do. But then as a believer and just as a human, I would say there is something outside that. I mean, I've experienced something that a historian telling my life, no biographer is ever going to write about me, but if they were, there are certain things about me that they just couldn't get at using their tools, but those things are real. So there are things in the human experience that I think exist outside what the secular disciplines that reside within the academy can actually get at. And we have to have the humility to admit that.
Yeah. Okay. Last question. What is the state of Mormon studies today, and where do you see it going?
Yeah, it's a great field. I love being in this field, and it's a growing field, but modestly. I mean, there's only so much growth. Let's not, Latter-day Saints still make up 0.2% of the world's population. So Mormon studies is never going to overshadow Islamic studies or the studies of Christianity or things like this. But it has been in growth mode for the past couple of decades, especially. The origins of Mormon studies go back to really the 1960s with the development of Mormon history as a professional discipline. And now we're in this century, we've seen just a proliferation. It's not just historians anymore. Now it's literary scholars and sociologists and other social scientists. It's I think some of the most exciting stuff that's going on right now in Mormon studies is in Mormon scripture studies. There's a Book of Mormon Studies Association. We just held the annual conference here at Utah State University. The quality of work that's being done there by the whole spectrum, from believing Latter-day Saints to non-believing non-Latter-day Saints. But people who are coming at this topic from a wide range of perspectives and seeing a lot of scholarly value here and producing new insight and new knowledge. It's actually really, really exciting. And so it's, again, I think the historians have kind of owned the past half century for the most part. And I think some of the most exciting stuff that's going on right now is in scripture studies, theological studies. And so it's a fun field to be a part of.
Great. Well, we'll pay attention to it. And there are a lot of new things coming out, and it's kind of exciting. So,
yeah.
Well, Patrick Mason, thanks so much for your time. Really appreciate you carving this time out for us and talking about a few things that to me just we don't dig down far enough on sometimes. And even though I know we've got some differing views on some things, I think it's important that there is a dialogue on this and that we can actually talk about it in a civil manner. So
totally.
Appreciate that.
And thanks for the opportunity. Thanks for the great questions. I completely agree. If we're not talking to each other, it's not Zion.
Yeah. All right. Thank you, Patrick. Appreciate it.
Thank you.